Well, thank you all for coming this lunchtime. It is great to see so many people here, and I hope it's not just for the free food. We've got a great set of panellists today. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Ed Boyd, the Deputy Policy Director at the Centre for Social Justice. And, the CSJ was set up 9 years ago, really with a simple principle to advocate for the bottom 10% who are often left behind, often not heard particularly loudly in the halls of power in Westminster. And so it's great for us to be involved in this debate about criminal justice, the changes that are going on at the moment, what we could do more to better rehabilitate people, protect people in society. Because so often it's these bottom 10% that are affected more and more by changes to the criminal justice system than perhaps the rest of us are sometimes. And there are a lot of changes that are going on at the moment. The current coalition government, amongst other things, are contracting out 70% of the work that the probation service does to the private and the voluntary sector, with an idea that they can innovate and bring new ways of doing things which can further push down reoffending rates. They are introducing rehabilitation prisons and resettlement prisons, and they're looking for the first time to extend statutory support for those that leave prison off the back of short sentences, less than 12 months or less, to make sure that they have a reduced chance of reoffending. And it is great, with all these changes going on, to have such an esteemed panel with us today to talk about these changes, to talk about as well, if they were in power, if they were Prime Minister today or in 2015, what would they be looking to bring in? What would they be looking to change? And delighted to have Sadiq with us here to talk about that especially. If I just talk through some of our panellists. On the far right, we have Anthony Ross from Bridges Ventures. He's the head of social sector funds, and they've been working closely with a number of voluntary organisations and others looking to get more involved in these criminal justice reforms as a potential funder that would work with these organisations to help them scale up and expand the amount of work they can do in the communities they work in. Next, we have Julia Lyon from the Prison Reform Trust. I note that in 2011 you were the most admired charity chief executive, and I thought I couldn't pass up the opportunity to embarrass you there. But it is delightful to have you with us. You've got great experience. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. Next we have Vicky Hellier-Cardwell, the director of the Criminal Justice Alliance, an alliance of 70 criminal justice organisations, voluntary sector organisations, and really delighted you could be with us. And last, by no means least, we are extremely delighted to have Sadiq Khan, the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, with us here today. And you only have to flick through the conference brochure to see just how much this man is in demand. You've spoken at a number of events already, and we are delighted that you could be with us today and you've made time for us. I think if we start with you, what we'll do is we'll hear for 5 minutes from each of the panelists. I'll chair the discussion, and then afterwards, when they've all spoken, there'll be a chance for Q&A from the floor, and we'll wrap up at around 1:30. So Sadiq, thank you so much for coming to speak, and I wonder if you can join me in welcoming him in the traditional way.
Don't forget the fact that I'm standing up now. But look, it's a pleasure to be. Obviously, it's great to be with such a distinguished panel, Anthony, Vicky, and Ed. But when Ed was talking about Juliet being the most admired chief executive, I mean, look, for us politicians, she's a pain in the backside, which is a good thing. The person that runs the Prison Reform Trust should be a thorn in the side of aspiring justice secretaries or the current justice secretary. That's the job of the PRT, and long may they continue to do that. Look, I want to do a quick race through my analysis and critique of where we are now and what a Labour vision would be. So look, who could be against a rehabilitation revolution? Who could be against there being more mentoring done of offenders and ex-offenders? Who could be against us trying to supervise also those offenders who receive less than 12 months custody? Who could be against having resettlement prisons nearer to people's home before they went to custody? Great platitudes, great aspirations, complete fictional politics to assume the government's current policies will get us there because they won't. Let me show you some of my concerns about the current government's policy, and it's great to have Jeremy Beecham in the audience, my colleague in the House of Lords, Lord Beecham, who is doing such a sterling job to try and challenge some of the issues which I'll talk about. Government privatising probation. They are saying that medium and low risk offenders, these include people found guilty of GBH, ABH, serious domestic violence, sexual offences, will now be, inverted commas, supervised by the likes of G4S, Serco, Tom Cubley, whoever wants to take over these contracts for a profit. High risk offenders won't be supervised by G4S and Serco because they can't be trusted with high risk offenders. So that in itself should make you think, hold on a second, the trained probation service will do with the high hanging fruit, high risk, yet the private sector will be doing medium and low risk, where risks fluctuate, where the police have concerns about sharing intelligence with the private sector, where there is a concern that nowhere in the world has payment by results and probation being privatised at those levels. And we've got a situation where more and more of our justice system is being privatised. We have almost reached a tipping point with the numbers of prisons being privatised. Not level playing field. It's good to have PJ here from Prison Officers Association. A situation where the brand spanking new prisons, which cost less per person per year for people to keep in prison, are given to the private sector, whereas the old expensive Victorian prisons the public sector has to run. So I've got real concerns about the direction of travel of the government's policy. We can talk about it during the discussion and debate. What would we do? My view and my vision is for a justice system which has victims at its centre. And when you speak to victims, what they want is, in the first place, not to be the victims of crime. If they are the victims of crime, they want the person caught. They want that person, of course, punished. They want him or her reformed as well. And we've seen in Northern Ireland some great work that Juliet's team did related to restorative justice, where you've got reoffending gone down, victim satisfaction high, and it's cheaper. Win, win, win. The government's not really using it very much. I want to have, in a primary act of Parliament, a victims law, which sets out in plain English what rights and entitlements victims have. So not only victims know that, but judges, magistrates, lawyers do as well. So you won't have a situation where you've got a victim of sexual abuse being called a predator, not just by the prosecution lawyer, but by the judge as well. And if we have a victims law with restorative justice as part of that, that will improve, I think, rehabilitation rates and be cheaper as well. I want a women's justice board. Look, the YJB has done a fantastic job in reducing offending and reoffending to the extent we're now closing down YOIs. Isn't that a fantastic achievement? We now have less people being first-time offenders, less young people reoffending, less youth custody. Well, I'll tell you what, let's do two things. One is extend that from 18 to 21, maybe higher. Two, use the same model for our women as well. 4,000 women in prison, many of them shouldn't be there, is a badge of shame. It is a badge of shame. Many of their mums were also in prison. And you know what? Many of their grandmums were also in prison as well. And my fear is many of their daughters, if we're not careful, will end up in the criminal justice system. We need to invest in intensive alternatives to custody that have the confidence of the public and that work. Good examples around the country of probation trusts in Manchester, in Avon and Somerset, in Liverpool, doing a really good job here. My vision is to have probation trusts with the autonomy to decide whether to commission the private sector, the voluntary sector, or charities in relation to how they run their probation service. And I end by saying this, you know, when we talk about the embarrassing fact that so few of those who are found guilty are rehabilitated, let's not forget, before they're arrested, many of them have multiple mental health problems. Many of them can't read or write, numeracy literacy of an 11-year-old. Many of them were looked after children and have been let down by the system. If we couldn't solve those problems in society, do we really think that probation officers will suddenly use their wand with prison officers and do a wand and they'll suddenly be rehabilitated? It's a nonsense. So as the Justice Secretary post 2015, I'll work with my Education Secretary and say, listen, you know what, cutting Sure Start may save you money, cutting family intervention projects may save you money, but it's a false economy. I'll say to my health colleagues, it's not acceptable that people with multiple mental health problems are in prison. It's not acceptable. I'll say to local authorities and the voluntary sector, what can you do to help us reduce crime and reduce reoffending? Thank you very much.
very much, Sadiq.
Right, thank you. What I want to do briefly, the Criminal Justice Alliance represents 70 organisations, mainly voluntary sector, but I want to say from the outset that the voluntary sector is incredibly diverse. So there are lots of organisations, perhaps with a turnover of 100 million, who are ready and willing to engage with the government's proposals, right down to really small voluntary sector organisations that might have a cohort of 10 or 15 offenders that they're working with. So what I'm not trying to do is present a voluntary sector point of view. I'm just wanting to reflect some of our members' views on what's happening. I think the first thing to say is really to underline and underscore the scale and significance of the reforms that are currently taking place. We're talking about 330,000 offenders who will be impacted by these changes. The vast majority of those on community sentences, but actually about 50,000 coming out of short-term prison sentences, and also around 50,000 who are coming towards the end of their sentence, who will now be in what we've been called resettlement prisons. But what happens in those resettlement prisons towards the end of their sentence will be largely dictated by the new probation providers. So we're talking about a very large number of offenders, 4 times as many as is currently in prison will be impacted by the changes. I mean, to put it in context, the work programme was about 1.2 million, so it's about a quarter of that number, but still hugely significant. And I think the other thing to say is that the government are proposing 7 to 10 year contracts, so these are long-term contracts for the rehabilitation of offenders. And that has a huge impact on the voluntary sector now. There's not time to sort of wait on the sidelines, see how the landscape lies in a couple of years' time and get involved. It really is a case of making a move now. There doesn't seem to be any provision for breaks in the contracts or refreshing or bringing in new providers. So the pressure on the voluntary sector right now to get involved or not and make those decisions is immense. And the final point to make is, although there have been some very interesting pilots in Peterborough and Doncaster doing some excellent work and some interesting interim results, we really do only have interim results for the payment by results pilots. And a very important point to underline in Peterborough is that programme was entirely voluntary. So all of the offenders who engaged in the Peterborough pilot coming out of prison did so voluntarily. That's completely different to the proposals that we're talking about. So I'll start with some of the positives. There is scope for innovation, and we think that the voluntary sector they don't have the monopoly on innovation, but clearly that is a big strength of the voluntary sector, and there may be opportunities for interesting partnerships to develop between mutuals, the private sector and the voluntary sector. It's worth noting, however, that about 400 organisations have signed up to the Ministry of Justice online database of organisations who are interested. To put that in context, a Third Sector Research Council study found that there were 20,000 charities in the UK working with offenders. So there's a vast number of organisations who haven't signed up yet, and we don't know why. And it may be that lots of those organisations have access to other funds through health or drug and alcohol or housing, but we are talking about a very small number who've signed up in comparison to what the voluntary sector does across the country. The other big positive is, of course, bringing in short sentenced offenders who are leaving prison currently with no support, no supervision. That's clearly not the fault of the probation service. They've never had the responsibility for this group, but it's excellent, we feel, that this group is finally getting some support to turn their lives around. And it looks like the contracts will offer quite a lot of freedom, so there is scope for new ways of working. In fact, the new contracts will offer the private sector and the voluntary sector far more freedom than probation ever had in terms of the work that it can do. And we've seen some positive moves from the government around some issues that we've campaigned on, along with others like Clinks, Revolving Doors Agency. For example, when the government set out on these reforms, they seemed very keen on a binary measure of reoffending. If you reoffend, you don't get your payment, that's it, which obviously leads to outcomes like creaming and parking of the most difficult offenders. They've listened to the sector, and they've now come up with a slightly more sophisticated analysis of reoffending based on seriousness and frequency alongside this binary measure. The latest document that came out last week also has taken on board some of our concerns around the very small charities at the bottom of the supply chain. And the document refers to grant funding. So there may be a possibility that the big primes take on the risk. They might pass it down to the next tier of organisations, but the very small charities that simply cannot wait for their delayed payment, cannot take on a huge amount of risk if they're working with small numbers. It looks like there's scope for those very small organisations to be grant funded. However, we have to see whether that will work in practice or not. I mean, we saw with the work programme, lots of organisations couldn't take part actually. Many signed up at the start and had to pull out because they simply weren't getting the referrals and couldn't do the work and couldn't take on the risk. So I think there's some issues, particularly for the small and medium-sized organisations that are going to be involved. Some of the potential problems or challenges that we need to overcome. There's a real challenge for the impact on the prison estate. I think that's slightly less talked about in these reforms, but actually money's being stripped out of our prisons at the moment. We're seeing a reduction in services, and yet these reforms, the government's own impact assessment assesses that these reforms will increase prison numbers by about 600 a year, and they will be short-term prisoners. So I think it's worth recognising that with a backdrop of prison overcrowding, very, very tight resources and very difficult conditions that people working in prisons are facing, that there will be an increase in prison numbers. And we'd like to see a little bit more work from the government on how to ensure that that number is as small as possible, because actually the worst thing for these reforms would be an increase in short-term prison numbers. The other thing I think we need to look at in a bit more detail and needs to be developed is how things will work locally, particularly with, I think Sadiq mentioned it, those other agencies that put in their resources into reducing reoffending at local level. So providers of drug and alcohol services, housing, how these new providers will build those local partnerships quickly enough and in a stable way that we'll see the results straight away, because obviously there's probation have spent years building up those resources with local commissioners, and we need to make sure that when we change the system, those local partnerships, which are absolutely crucial for reducing reoffending, aren't lost, particularly in the pace of change. A final risk, I think, is maintaining the confidence of magistrates and judges in the new sentences that will be provided. I think the view of the courts and the role of the courts has been underplayed in the proposals, and I think if magistrates are not 100% confident in the sentence that's being offered and who is offering it, they may end up using prison more. So that's another thing we just need to make sure that we watch. And we think things like sentencing reviews, where magistrates can oversee sentences, call people back, see how it's going, or potentially get more involved in visiting local projects, would be a good way of maintaining their confidence in the system. My last point is a bit of an optimistic one, which is, crime is down, and the latest Ipsos Mori poll put public concern about crime has now dropped to 8th on the list of public concerns. So, unemployment, housing, those issues have risen to the top. Crime is further down. So I hope and think there's an opportunity for some political consensus around the next election on crime and justice, particularly on moving money out of prisons, but not simply out of prisons, but back into communities and reinvesting that money, and perhaps even political consensus about bringing down prison numbers. So I leave that there as an opportunity for the three parties in the run-up to the next election.
I think it was at this conference a while back when Ed Miliband was elected to lead the party that he said, I agree with Ken Clarke, I want to reduce prison numbers. And that felt like a dawn of that kind of collaborative politics that we're not much used to in this country. I'm not sure that it's real. I want to say a few things about Labour's legacy, which I think is really important and powerful, and not always acknowledged even by its own people. So I'll be a pain in the backside to Sadiq, happily. First thing to say, I think, is that Labour really stands for human rights, it stands for equalities. It did so much work on those fronts, and I think if you're thinking about prisons and penal policy, you have to see it in that context. And you also have to think about how far that's been eroded over the last few years. There are examples of Labour's legacy where clearly the current coalition government have built on it in a very fruitful and effective way. I don't think it has in relation to human rights and equalities. So that's the first point I want to make. Then what did Labour set up fairly recently? Some very good and important things. The Sentencing Council, hugely important way of trying to get more consistency in sentencing, a better balance across the country. And I think to a large extent that's working well. It made some terrible errors in relation to sentencing. The biggest single one that people will know about is the IPP sentence, Kafkaesque sentence, introduced in a hurry, the worst drafted, I think, Chief Inspector at the time said, that she'd ever seen. Net result, 6,500 people still in custody, still serving that sentence, and a lot of work going on to try and make sure that they can be released in a safe and appropriate way. And I think it was good that David Blunkett himself acknowledged that it hadn't turned out as he'd intended when he was Home Secretary. So some gains on Sentencing Council, some minuses in relation to IPPs. Community payback was established by Labour, by Jack Straw, a very effective way of introducing really much more robust community sentences. Community sentences are now outperforming short spell in custody for similar offenders, similar offences by around 7%, so just under 10%. Why not build on that instead of selling off the probation service? It does seem that there's a lot of scope to build on those very good community sentences. Sadiq mentioned integrated offender management, the IOM schemes. Again, a Labour initiative, some really brilliant work going on in the areas that Sadiq's mentioned. So those are very good footholds for reform. They're largely, in our view, because we're a cross-party group, too important to argue about. And there are some more reforms that I think are even more important that we don't start arguing about them. So the Corston review, I think everyone in the room will remember that review. I was a member of Jean Corston's review panel. What we could see quite clearly in the visits we did to women's prisons, the visits that we did to women's centres, was how just that one defining characteristic about vulnerable women, if you see them in prison, they become very dependent, very much less able to take responsibility for their lives and for their children. You see them in a women's centre, they're paying their bills, they're getting treatment for addictions, they're sorting out their lives, they're getting skills for jobs, and they're finding safe housing. It's completely different, and yet these are the same kind of women serving the same revolving door short sentences. So we really welcome the Labour commitment to establish a Women's Justice Board. This government have set up a women's advisory group, a ministerial chaired advisory group, which is a step in the right direction, but it can't have the same kind of clout, the same kind of budget, and the same kind of drive that we would have if we had a Women's Justice Board. So I think that's very clear. Remember, that came out of the 6 suicides at Style Prison. That was the genesis for that particular reform. And linked to that, Keith Bradley, Lord Bradley's review, initiated by Labour, to look at mental health and learning disability in the prison system. That really is a very clear benchmark for a major change. Diversion and liaison services, which are now being established, and coalition government have really embraced this particular measure. They've put aside already 50 million, or rather they've spent 50 million, they're about to spend another 50 million, setting up diversion and liaison schemes in courts and police stations so that people can have the assessments they need. Couple that with the no real prospect test that they've introduced to reduce unnecessary remand, and you're getting a better balance. So all of that might be good, but then we get into the new set of reforms under reforming rehabilitation, and things I think start to unravel quite fast. So I want to spend the second half of my 5 minutes talking about that, which is, okay, you've got these advantages, and also, as Sadiq mentioned, you've got the reduction of more than 50% in the number of under 18-year-olds going to prison. And they're really big gains. The youth justice reforms are big gains, started by Labour, continued by coalition. what's happening now, offender rehabilitation, I like the way you started, because who is going to argue with rehabilitation? We would argue with it as it's set out at the moment. I think what it's masking is some really bad rollback in prisons. Vicky's mentioned it too. Conditions and treatment rolling backwards. I'm going into prisons quite regularly, talking to staff, governors, talking to prisoners and seeing the staff cutbacks, hearing about them, only hearing about last night. People being worried about safety, voluntary organisations not even letting their staff go out on wings, which is extraordinary because they're fearful that there won't be prison staff around who can guarantee their safety. And this is taking us back, because what we were looking at was a much more civilised prison system. If you look at it, it's not that long ago, no slopping out, improving treatment and conditions, getting better education and health services going in prisons. This is a real rollback, and I think it's dangerous and it's very troubling. The report on Portland that came out yesterday from the Independent Monitoring Board said 50% increase in self-harm here at Portland. So the story about rehabilitation and resettlement is pretty much the story. The ambitions are good, but the way of doing it is routing everything through prison. It's seeing prison as the gateway for any kind of help and treatment for vulnerable people. If, as Chris Grayling does, you recognise that people in prison have a number of things that they are dealing with and have been dealing with for years, and that will range from addictions, mental health needs, learning disabilities, and everyone in the room knows the list, I don't need to go through it. But if you recognise that, then you would surely go for a joined-up approach across government departments, across local authority departments, and you'd attend to housing, you'd attend to health, and you try and do that as part of a coherent picture. Instead of which, the Offender Rehabilitation Bill essentially is routing everyone through prison. If you do a 2-day, if this bill is passed, if you do a 2-day prison sentence, you will find yourself supervised for a year. This is a disproportionately long term. I don't agree with Vicky about it's excellent. Of course it's excellent for people to get mentoring and support, but ideally if they volunteer to have it, and then they will make use of it. If it's imposed on them, what we'll get is what the government impact statement says we'll get, which is 13,000 more people in prison, because people will be recalled to custody. People whose lives are pretty messed up are not going to manage to stick with those reforms and to stick with what they're required to do, walking on eggshells for a year after a petty offence. It's not the right approach. The aim, the overall objective is absolutely right, but the approach, I think, is pretty troubling. Vicky's talked about payment by results. We're concerned about it. We don't see that there are models ahead. It'd be interesting to hear from you about what you see for it, because I feel that we don't understand enough about it. We can see that commissioning and contracting are vital, and we can see that that's got to be done very intelligently, and we can see the need for provision for review. We don't like the business language. We don't like to see a really important public service turned into a kind of marketplace where the whole emphasis is on supply chains, marketisation, creaming and parking. It's awful. And in Stafford, we lost the patient. Everybody has cause to regret what happened in Stafford. The Chief Inspector is saying we're losing the prisoner. We mustn't lose that prisoner. We mustn't lose that person in prison. We have to recognise that there is an individual who's there to serve a time in what should be our punishment of last resort. It isn't. And for those who've got to serve that punishment of last resort because their offending is so serious nothing else will do, it should be a decent, humane place. And that's what the public expect. You know, we're doing partnerships at the moment with the WI, with the Seroptimists, with various civic society organisations. We're running polling with ISDM and YouGov. The public are perfectly comfortable with the idea that prison is that last resort and that there are many, many other ways of dealing with offenders and getting them to take responsibility for their lives and turning their lives around. So, you know, I'm just saying to Labour, please remember that what you didn't do last time was to join up your social justice agenda and your human rights agenda and your equalities agenda with your criminal justice agenda. And if you get in next time, please do that.
Thank you. I'm not going to be here just to defend payment by results contracts. I'll avoid that. Let me just give you, we're probably perhaps less familiar than the others. What we actually do is we are a social investor looking to support social sector organisations, only social sector organisations, who are out to deliver interventions and try and scale that up. And an example I think of a payment by results contract which is just closed is the adoption bond, where there's more money going in to fund more adoption. And that's really the model, and I'll come back to that because I think it's quite important as to whether that's really relevant here. What our engagement, being a social investor with capital, and all the capital we have is from foundations looking to invest to support these organisations. We've obviously been approached by many of the social sector organisations and charities looking to engage with this reform. And we actually started right back looking at the short sentence business when the Innovation Fund rules came out. And to be fair to the NOMS and MOJ, we did engage a lot with them to explain why their payment by results mechanism didn't work, and that was pulled back, which I think was right, because I don't think that the binding mechanism would have worked in that case. I think what's been interesting for us, and this is a new sector we come to, we looked at others, is engaging with the organisations. There was a real message that they all feel there is scope for great improvement, and that in some ways is encouraging. In some ways you sit back and say, well, why hasn't some of that happened already? And I think there's a challenge for lots of public services. If so many of those currently delivering, this includes the mutuals, think that there is a great scope for engagement, there is that question as to what has held this back. But there is clearly an opportunity to be unlocked to both, from what we see, both improve outcomes and probably reduce spend. I think the other positives I would take is I think the MOJ genuinely, and certainly those looking to deliver this, have engaged with trying to think about how they can ensure that this reform does drive a reduction in reoffending. I think it's really hard, and I'll come to some of the negatives, but I think they have really tried hard, and you mentioned about the changing the metrics to try and drive that. But it's not easy, and I think they have also engaged with trying to ensure that the social sector organisations, many of the charities that were already engaged with probation, are going to get a look in, and they have definitely learned from the lessons of the work programme, which clearly didn't work for a lot of the social sector, and it's probably not working overall. So there's been a real effort, and a momentum to try and make this a positive reform. The bad news is that despite of all of that, when you get under it, it's very hard to get away from the main driver being cutting cost. And if I go back to my, what is so-called payment by results contracts about? They're about investment to improve better outcomes. That's where you should start from. So in theory, if you are going to deliver something better, you probably should accept you're probably going to have to invest up front to get something better and then save in the future. Yeah. This is actually the other way around. This is about cutting costs first, and then the hope that a streamlined organisation will then look to use some of those savings to address the short-term offenders and other reforms. And I think that is a quite big bet. And I suppose then goes on to the payment by results contracts. I suppose that as a believer in those contracts, if they work well, I would say that when we had the early discussions, and there was a lot of consultants to try and get this to work, we were quite encouraged by the thinking about how can we get these mechanisms such that, for example, you should have an increased payment the greater and greater you reduce the reoffending, because clearly it's harder. It's harder to as you go further into difficulty. But some of that does seem to be falling away, and I think that essentially what we're going to be getting is some penalties, some incentives, a bit like the sort of Doncaster type model, and somewhere away from the Peterborough model, which I think could genuinely be more innovative. I suppose the other thing that has increasingly concerned us is, despite that initial enthusiasm and support of trying to learn from the work programme and engage with the social sector, the reality is when you look at the size of contract, if you look at the funding requirement that's been placed on bidders, it's going to make it really hard for social sector organisations to be part of the prime bidding contract, which then effectively puts all of the private sector organisations as the prime bidder, subcontracting to social sector organisations. And from our perspective, we will much sooner be backing a social sector organisation that's managing the prime contract, because I think it's closer to the sort of model I think you're referring to, where the ethos of the organisation that's controlling the capital is all sound, rather than backing social sector organisations that are delivering a subcontract to a private sector organisation. And I think there are probably, there are 1 or 2 mutuals that I think have got a reasonably good shot, and we will look to support those if we can. There are 1 or 2 large social sector organisations already engaged with delivering services that are going to give it a shot, but I think the bar is quite high. And that sort of brings me on to, I suppose, my conclusion. I think all of those engaged with this are going to have to be large from a social sector perspective. They're going to have to deliver what I think will be a pretty tough contract, actually, for anybody. I think the requirement is going to force very rapid restructuring with disruption that's been referred to over the first year or 2, just to ensure that the contract remains liquid. If one gets through that, there does seem to be a lot of scope to improve and apply some of those freed up resources, but I think it's the first 2 or 3 years are going to be quite challenging.